we've discussed stocks. In the last chapter, we introduced bonds. And now we're going to think about connecting stocks and bonds into a lifetime of investing. We haven't discussed tax shelters much yet, but we will get there. So things like, whether you're going to use an IRA or 401k, all that kind of stuff, that will come up. And eventually we'll get out of the realm of investing and we'll talk about, buying a house and Social Security, health insurance, lots of really important topics. But for now, we're still in that world of stocks and bonds. So when you're thinking about building your portfolio, you could go to one extreme. You could do 100% stocks. Investing totally in stocks will pretty much maximize your return. If you're going to go stocks or bonds, going fully into stocks is probably the maximum way to, or the way to maximize your returns in investing. But the downside of that is you're also going to take on lots of risk. So there's an inherent trade-off. The more heavily you go into stocks, the higher the expected return. But also, the more heavily you go into stocks, the higher the expected risk. So you've got to decide how much risk and return are you willing to take. To give you an idea of that, take a look at this that I'm putting on the screen right now, and it will show you the relationship between your portfolio's percentage that's invested in stocks and the historical return and number of years of negative return and so forth. And what you can see there is if you invest 100% in stocks over the last, this is about 95 years of data, there have been 26 years of negative returns, an average return of about 10%. But you can see the extreme there. The worst year was a 43% reduction in the value of that account. A 43% reduction in the value of your account doesn't really matter much when you're 25 years old, most likely. But if you were 70 and you had all of your money invested in stocks, that 43% reduction could be utterly devastating and mean you have to try to go back to work or accept a major lifestyle change. So you might try to hedge your bets a little bit. If you look at the category there with 60% stocks, you can see 60% stocks, there's still a lot of negative years there, about 23 years out of about 95. But you can see the most extreme bad year was only a downturn of 26.6%. As we learned in the last chapter, years of recessions have negative stock returns, but bonds actually perform usually quite well during recessionary periods. So you'll kind of hedge your bet there by holding more bonds. So how much stock to hold, how much bond to hold, there's really no good answer. But as a starting point, we might consider the idea of investing your age in bonds. Now this is a really rudimentary approach. It's also kind of arbitrary. It's not something I would expect you to fully follow, but it's a good starting point for thinking about building your own strategy. So the logic behind investing your age in bonds is when you are 20, you would go 20% of your portfolio into bonds. When you're 40, you go 40% into bonds. 60, you go 60% in bonds, and so forth. So maybe every year or so you would go into your portfolio and you would adjust it so that it fits more along with your goals. Again, I said it's rudimentary, I said it's arbitrary, it really is. But you need to have some sort of strategy like this. Because think about it, if you don't do anything with your bonds, you're going to end up with some very wild results. If you just leave your portfolio alone, it's going to deviate greatly from what you anticipated when you began. And in fact, if you look at the table that I'm showing you here right now, this is a scenario imagining somebody who's investing 80% in stocks and 20% in bonds, and then they just leave that account alone. Even though they started out 80% stocks, as the years go by, a greater and greater share of their portfolio becomes stock oriented. And that's because stocks typically outperform bonds. So if you just choose a strategy like 20% bonds, 80% stocks, and then you leave it forever, you're going to end up taking on more and more risk as you get older, which is the exact opposite of what you should be wanting to do. So the invest your age in bonds approach goes against that inherent effect that would occur if you do nothing. Now, this might seem, again, arbitrary, but it does provide some really nice advantages. The obvious advantages it provides, number one, is that you reduce your risk as you age. Now, that's obvious, right? When you're 60 years old, you'll be taking on less risk than when you were 20. That's the obvious one, and that is a big advantage. What's less obvious is the impact that this portfolio plan will have on your performance. If you use a strategy like Invest Your Age in Bonds, or something similar to this, you will automatically buy low and sell high. Let me show you what I mean. Let's say that you are employing a 50% stock, 50% bond portfolio. Maybe you're following this strategy perfectly and you're 50 years old. Let's say that there is a crash. Now, which of these are more likely to experience a substantial crash? It's definitely stocks, right? Stocks are much more volatile. So maybe there's a big decline in the stock market and it leaves you with this balance. Okay, you've got $80,000 in stocks and $100,000 in bonds. Now, you got to stick to your strategy. Even though there's been a decline in the stock market, you're going to have to go back in and do what's called rebalancing. Rebalancing is reconfiguring your portfolio to get it back to the allocation that you originally preferred. You're still 50 years old, you want a 50-50 portfolio. You now have $180,000 in assets. So what you need to do is sell $10,000 in bonds and buy $10,000 in stocks. That puts you now at $90,000 in each. And what you did is when the stock market receded, you bought more stock. That's good because it's rebalancing, getting you back to your 50-50 portfolio, but it also goes against the kind of adverse psychological effects that most people have. Most people, when the stock market declines, they get scared and they're actually more likely to sell stock. If anything, you should be buying when the market is down. So if you stick to your strategy, you will automatically buy low when the market is down. Likewise, if the stock market experiences a rapid increase in valuation, maybe your stocks are now $120,000 in your portfolio while your bonds are relatively stable. Now what you need to do is sell stocks. You've got $220,000 in value here, so you need to sell $10,000 in stocks, buy $10,000 in bonds, and effectively what you've done is when the market was up, you sold when stocks were highly valued. So this is a nice kind of trick that comes from the Invest Your Age in Bonds approach, is it does allow you to take advantage of these swings in the market in an advantageous way. And in fact, that does allow you to actually claw back some of the cost that comes from holding bonds. Holding bonds in general does reduce the value of your account, but because of these effects, you do claw a little bit of that back. So for example, holding 10% bonds versus holding 0% bonds really isn't that different once you consider the fact that you get this extra little benefit. So it allows you to reduce your risk as you age. It gives you that nice little trick of buying low, selling high. And third, and perhaps this is most important, and we alluded to this already, it eliminates emotion. There's a lot of research out there that shows that, emotions are a real problem when it comes to investing, and this is something I talk a good bit about in the book. The people that are very emotional are the ones I see have the most trouble with their finances. A lot of people who have a tendency to be very emotional like to keep a lot of their money in checking accounts because they're afraid of what would happen if they invest in stocks. They kind of go through life allowing emotions to guide their choices. You really want to try to avoid allowing emotions to play any sort of role in your decision-making processes and finances. And I know sometimes that can be painful, but I'm in the game of giving advice, and I'm not in the game of trying to make you feel good. Okay, So what I would say is if you can get to retirement and have plenty of assets, you're going to feel really good then. And you have to go through some pain, including emotional pain, to get to that point in the future. So what I like about a strategy like this is for a person that's inherently emotional, it gives them rules to follow. The market goes down, they want to panic sell? No. They're going to stick to what they provided, what they said they would do from the forefront, which is to invest their age in bonds. So I really like strategies like this, even if I don't perfectly prefer this specific strategy. So what we might try to do is improve on that approach. One thing I would say right away is the invest your age in bonds approach is probably too safe, actually far too safe for most investors. I know for me it would be way safer than I would like. So what you might decide to do is, instead of invest your age in bonds, invest your age divided by 2 in bonds. So when you're 20 years old, invest 10% in bonds. When you're 40 years old, invest 20% in bonds. Something like that. Some kind of rule that you can stick to that fits with what you like and what you prefer. I think that'll help you out in the long run. But these decisions aren't made in a vacuum. Everybody is different, and other assets and your goals, your desires, what you want to do in the future, these things also play a significant role. So if we're trying to decide what percent of our portfolio should be stocks and what percent should be bond, there are other things we need to consider. One is to consider other assets. And one way to think about that is to try to categorize your assets. Are the assets that you have more bond-like, or are the assets that you have more stock-like? Okay, so bond-like assets would be assets that are relatively stable. So for example, let's say that you own a bunch of land somewhere and that land is pretty stable. You might consider that more like a bond. Let's say you own a small company or shares of a small company. Obviously that's more stock-like. And those types of assets should play into your decision-making process. A lot of people don't think that way though. They think, if I own small shares of some company, they don't even consider that when they're thinking about their other investing strategies. So why this matters, I'll give you my own example. I have a pension that when I retire is going to pay me something like $80,000 a year. All right, we're going to talk about pensions later on in this book, but a pension provides a very stable income source. So this is definitely bond-like, okay? A pension is very bond-like. It's not unpredictable. It's very stable. In fact, it's more stable than bonds. So knowing that I have this, I should be riskier with the rest of my assets, or at least that's how I choose to use this information, right? I've already got stability, so I can be riskier with the rest of my assets. So as a direct result of that, I'm 38 years old and I hold almost no bonds. Something like 3 to 5% of my portfolio is bonds. If I didn't have this, I would definitely be much more bond heavy. But the logic, I think, is sound. If I'm 55 years old and the market collapses, yeah, that'll hurt. But I've already got this asset, much like a bond, that will allow me to survive, right? So think about the other assets that you have. Also think about how long you have until retirement. If you're 70 years old and you're not planning to retire until you're 80, well, that's different than somebody who's 70 years old and is already retired. Generally speaking, the more years you have until retirement, the riskier you can be with the rest of your investments. And this is why the invest your age in bonds approach is maybe a little too simplistic. Investing your age in bonds only works really well when people have very predictable retirement ages. Somebody who is 53 and plans to retire at 55 really depends on the circumstance, but we might say that this person should be a little bit safer with their investments because they don't have much more time left to earn extra money. So if the market were to crash now at age 53, they might have to go back to work if all of their money is invested in stocks. So they might need to be a little bit more cautious. And it doesn't have to be retirement. It really could be anything else. If you're thinking, I plan on buying a really expensive house 2 years from now, then you probably can't have all of your money invested in stocks. You need to keep some money relatively safe so that you can access it in the future. There's no exact answer for how much, and everybody has different risk tolerances. If I was planning on buying a house 2 years from now, I think I'd probably still leave it all in stocks and say, if the market declines, I just won't buy the house. But other people feel differently about that. And if you're very set on putting money into a house 2 years from now, then you have to take precautions and be less risky with your investing. And then third, ask yourself what you're saving for. This is really a very similar answer to number 2. Think about your time horizon. Are you, saving for yourself? Or future generations? So, somebody who's 70 years old, who has $500,000 invested, I would feel pretty comfortable saying this person should be primarily invested in bonds, or at least very heavily invested in bonds. This person basically is going to exhaust almost all of this money before death, so they really need to be prepared to spend that money. On the contrary, somebody who's 70 and lives a pretty cheap lifestyle and has $10 million invested, this person, you could kind of go two ways with this. One, you could say is they don't need to have any stocks because they have plenty of money. But you need to talk to this person and decide what they want to do. And, this could go for you, or if you're providing guidance to someone else. If a 70-year-old says, I've got $10 million, I need to spend $1 million of it myself, but I'm planning on leaving $9 million for my grandchildren. Well, now the grandchildren's time horizon is what we should really care about. If their grandchild is 5 years old now, they may have decades before they actually need to spend that money. So we could think of this money as really being more like their grandkids' money, and you might go 100% into stocks with those assets there. And then with the remaining $1 million, we might go much safer than that. So, everybody's different, and when it comes to building a portfolio, there is no perfect advice. You have to think about all of the aspects that, should be considered to make an informed decision about how a portfolio should be set. But regardless, you really should have some sort of plan in mind. Now, if you want to take a much more simple approach, or if you're giving guidance to someone else, when I'm talking to my personal finance students, I talk very differently to them than I would just some random person. People who seek out my class, they usually care a lot about finances, and they really are quite savvy in their decision making. The average person is not like that. The average person that I meet with is scared to talk about finances. They have an embarrassingly low level of financial literacy, and they make very bad financial decisions. For somebody like that, I want to make things as easy as I possibly can. Because truth be told, you don't have to make amazing decisions or truly understand what you're doing. You just have to do something, right? In other words, you don't have to know why you're making the financial choices you're making. You just have to make the right choices. And one really easy choice to make is to invest in something called a target date fund. These have gotten very popular in recent years, and I'm a really big fan of them. I don't have a whole lot of my own money invested in them, but when I'm talking to, friends, cousins, aunts, uncles, I often try to push them towards target date funds because, frankly, they're kind of idiot-proof, and they still do a really good job of growing wealth. Target date funds automatically do everything we were just talking about. They automatically reduce risk as you get older. And I'll show you how they do that here in a second. So they automatically reduce risk as you age. 2, they automatically rebalance. Remember, rebalancing means to make transactions to get back to your original preferred set of allocation. So they automatically do that for you. And 3, they automatically diversify across all assets. So most target date funds include U.S. stock, international stocks, U.S. bonds, and international bonds. So effectively, you could put all of your money into a target date fund, and you really would be doing a great job of building a portfolio. It's almost like you have your own financial planner, but you have to pay them very little because this is effectively automated, okay? Usually these have pretty low expense ratios. So if you start looking at target date funds, which are often found in tax sheltered accounts, like 401ks, what you're going to see is a bunch of different years. You might see target date fund. These will have different names, because this is it's a product, right? So they're not just going to generically say target date fund 24. They're going to have some sort of name like a life cycle fund, Fidelity 2040, something like that. So you might look at your different options and you see, target date fund 2040, 2050, 2060, something like this. You're probably going to have options in either 10-year increments or 5-year increments. And the idea behind these funds is the year represents your expected retirement year. So younger people will choose a later year. Older people will generally choose an earlier year. But of course, you can choose anything you want, okay? And you can mix and match. Maybe this 2040 one's not exactly what you want. 2050 isn't really either, and you wish you had something between the two. Well, you can put half your money in the 2040 and half your money in the 2050, okay? Inherently, the 2060 fund is going to be much more risky. It's going to contain more stocks. In fact, in the book, I go through and show what a typical target date fund, how its allocation is set up. A 2060 target date fund, the one that I point out, has 90% stock weight. So 90% of the investment is into stocks. For the fund that is 2040, it's only 78% stocks. And what's really nice about these assets is they're not set in stone, they're dynamic. As the years go by, the 2060 will stay the same. This 2060 fund is not going to change, but the asset will, okay? So you can just keep pumping money into this fund if you want, but as the years pass, it's going to inherently become less risky. It's been designed to do that. Furthermore, if there's a year of really bad stock returns, it will reallocate. Sell bonds, buy stocks to get back to its original allocation. So it's a dynamic thing. It will inherently change as you get older, okay? So these are really great funds. So if I'm talking to somebody who is, 34 years old, I'm telling you, you probably have some pretty good financial skills. You're seeking it out right now. And even if you just watch these videos and pay attention, you're going to be in the top 20% of every adult when it comes to understanding personal finance. And what you'll see is people have no clue what they're doing. You'll ask them, what do you have in your 401k? And they'll just flat out say, I don't know. Like they don't have any clue, okay? So when I'm dealing with some random person and they're saying, what should I invest in? And I look in their 401k and I see they have one of these, into the ballgame for me. Let's just keep it as simple as we possibly can, because I don't trust them to reallocate their resources in the future. I don't trust them to go back in and sell and buy stocks and bonds to get back to their original goals. They're not going to do any of that. So I need the account to do it for them. So somebody who's 34 years old, the way I see it is they're probably about 35 years away from retirement. So what I would do is I'd toss them into the 2060 fund, and that would do a pretty good job of reaching the goals that they need. If they tell me that they want to take on more risk, well, I'll try to find a 2070 fund if there's one out there. But the bottom line is, once you put money into this fund, you can just keep contributing and you don't have to worry about its risk through time. It will inherently become less risky. So it's a great set it and forget it type of an investment option. For you and I, it's maybe a little bit rudimentary, but for the typical investor, it's exactly what they need. So that's a good taste of investing with stocks and bonds. You got to figure out some sort of strategy. If you're a college student, probably just go 100% into stocks. Now, that's your own decision, of course, but if we think about the time horizon you have so many years until retirement. Now is the time to be taking on risk. When you get older, return back to this information and try to figure out what your allocation should be.